So we're calling this message this morning, Divided by Sin and United by Sovereignty. We're going to jump right into the text this morning, which is 1 Kings 11:26 through 40. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. That's Solomon that he's rebelling against. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David, his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country. And Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Asherah, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws, as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose, and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you, and walk in obedience to me, and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever." Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, to Pharaoh, and stayed there until Solomon's death. So a few years ago, someone that I care very much about lost their job unexpectedly. And the experience for them led to a lot of questions, some very real life concerns, but also some more, philosophical, sort of esoteric type worries about life. If you've ever lost a job, you know that when this happens, yes, there's financial concern, but at times that's the least of our concerns. There's also this jarring reminder of something we should have known, but we tend to forget, which is that we're not in control. And so, yes, we go, how will I pay the bills? But we also go, oh yeah, I'm not really calling the shots. Feeling out of control, whether we've lost a job or it's just a different aspect of life, we know the feeling well. Everyone in this room knows what it feels like to come to those startling realizations. We are not in control. Uncontrol, when that becomes our at least accepted position, is something that certainly leads to uncertainty. That feeling that life is somehow spinning out of our grasp and we cannot bring it back now. And so we see it in the news. Pastor Brianne mentioned it, especially lately. We hear a lot of people making a lot of promises, and we see and hear a lot of people making a lot of threats. We feel it at work. We feel it with our kids. We feel it with our marriages, our minds, our bodies, our careers. And it's pretty easy to feel like no one is actually able to steer this ship that we call the world. It seems like there is a lot more failure and pain and lurking catastrophes and blind sides, then there are reasons for hope. But the good news is we are just one generation of countless generations who have come before us, who have come to discover that God's purposes actually do in fact prevail. Because this that we are living in is in fact His story, not ours, as much as we would like to believe otherwise. And having relationship with us for reasons that are at times described as a mystery has motivated God to never abandon His divine desire for relationship with people like us. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So here's the sermon in a sentence to get us going, so you know where we're headed this morning. Even in the midst of rebellion and division, God's sovereign plan remains unshaken. He uses even human failure to fulfill His redemptive purposes and preserve His promise. So the story of Israel's division in 1 Kings 11, and then it bleeds into chapter 12 as well, gives us this reminder that even when things seem chaotic, God's sovereign plan is very much intact. This story teaches us that human failure doesn't discount God's plan, even when things blindside us, even when catastrophes come, God does in fact remain in control, working out His purposes through, and this is the amazing part, flawed leaders and fractured nations and even sinful people. And I think that this is an important word for today, that God continues to work out His purposes through flawed leaders and fractured nations. So here's our first consideration this morning. Jeroboam's rise was part of God's judgment on Solomon's unfaithfulness. Jeroboam's rise was actually part of God's judgment on Solomon's unfaithfulness. So we'll just read 26 through 33 again. So Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he rebels against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials. Jumping down to 27, here's the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the terraces, and he'd filled the gap in the wall, the city of David his father. Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. He is the minister of labor for the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone. He takes hold of the cloak that he is wearing, and he tears it into 12 pieces. Then he says to Jeroboam, "Take 10 for yourself. I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But I'm going to preserve David," he says. But then jumping to 33, why? Why is God doing this? "I will do this because they," Israel, Solomon, "have forsaken me and worshipped Ashereth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." So what we learn here in this section of chapter 11 is Jeroboam's rise to power is in fact a direct consequence of Solomon's unfaithfulness. Once again, here we find, and if you have been tracking in this Divine Desire series, this is a repeated theme. Israel's history is repeating itself. Here they are failing again. Remember, if you were here last week, just 2 chapters before this story, God tells Solomon, "I've heard your prayer," that prayer when he dedicated the temple. "I've heard your prayer, and my eyes and my heart will be on this place forever. And if you walk faithfully with me, then I will be faithful to ensure that your kingdom lives on." That is the start of 1 Kings chapter 9. 2 chapters later, we get a record of Solomon's insatiable appetite for foreign wives. And these foreign wives end up leading Solomon to completely mosaic the worship culture of Israel. They start to worship everybody and everything because all of Solomon's wives want their own gods represented too. Complete compromise, complete sellout. And then after that, we are introduced in chapter 11 to some characters that rise up as adversaries to Solomon. And Jeroboam is one of these characters. So let me remind you who this Jeroboam fellow is. So 26 and 28 of chapter 11, we see that Jeroboam's not an outsider. He's not somebody coming from a different nation. He was a capable leader, in fact, working in Solomon's royal administration. This is a fairly young guy, it seems, that is driven by ambition. He's certainly got some skill, and he rises to a position of authority, overseeing, again, this labor force for these two tribes of Joseph. Then he becomes disillusioned with Solomon's oppressive policies. He gets very frustrated with how Solomon is treating people. And so, as we see in history and over again, he decides to then lead a revolt against this king who he doesn't like the way he's doing things. It doesn't go well for him, so he goes and he hides in Egypt until Solomon dies. Eventually comes back. And he does become king of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, just as God said, splitting God's people into a divided kingdom. And so my interest then this morning in Jeroboam's story isn't so much what Jeroboam did or even how this story ends. Rather, I want to emphasize that Jeroboam's rise and his rebellion, the chaos going on in this nation, weren't random and they weren't outside of God's sovereign control. In fact, Jeroboam was used by God as a consequence for Solomon's sin. And yes, Jeroboam became disillusioned by Solomon's leadership, and so there's some aspect of like personal agency and determination to act this way, but this is still God's hand. I can assure you, church, that if Solomon had walked faithfully with God as God has acted, Jeroboam would not have had a minute of success in leading a rebellion. The reason he has success is because God says, I'm going to use you then to show that there are consequences for those who reject me. In verse 29, we read about this prophet, Ahijah, whose prophecy demonstrates God's control over events. Ahijah symbolically tears the kingdom apart, standing there in front of Jeroboam, revealing that this is not just a political division, this is not just a reordering of some territories, but this is a divine judgment being spoken from the words and the lips of a prophet of God. And the reason is clear: Solomon's idolatry and failure to remain faithful to Yahweh. God says, I will do this because. I will do this because. You have forsaken me, you've worshipped other gods, and you've not walked in obedience to me. I will do this because. And so God acts decisively, informing Jeroboam he will one day have his own kingdom because Solomon failed to be true to God. And so I think this story reminds us of something that we would at times rather not believe to be true, but also something that too often we fail to remember. So there are two things in here I want to highlight. First, I think we would at times rather not believe that sin has real consequences. At least not our sin. We're pretty cool when the sin of our enemies has consequences. We don't want our sin to have any consequences. Because God's not like that, right? God is like that. There is consequences. There is fallout for sin. But this story shows so clearly that even in the midst of spiritual consequences, consequences that are more than just individual even, but in fact fracture families and communities and even nations, that God is still faithful. And that's the truth I think we too often fail to remember. One we reject, one we forget. And that is that even though Solomon's sin had consequences, God still remains in control. And so it is for us that God, who is entirely good and God, who is entirely just, is not removed from or outside of the consequences or fallout from sin. Whether it's our sin or whether it's someone else's sin. God is still in control. God is aware. God is involved. And still true as the ultimate King of Kings. Which leads right into point 2, which is that rebellion doesn't reduce God's control. I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I've made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands, that's Rehoboam, and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son, so that David my servant will always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you, walk in obedience to me, do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty, as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. So I suspect some of us need to be encouraged by this promise that rebellion doesn't reduce God's control. Whether it's personal, whether it's familial, whether it's at work, or even if it is on a national or global scale, rebellion does not reduce God's control. Rebellion in many ways is an attempt to break away from God's rule over our lives. We rebel because we want to go our own way, we want to do our own thing, we want to imagine up our own truth, and we want to worship whatever is kind of the easiest for us to worship. Rebellion is always an attempt to challenge and push back against God's control and sovereignty over our life or our situations. But the good news is if you find yourself anxious, afraid, angry, or even defeated because you see people with the ability to influence your life not acting in accordance with God's will, there's still encouragement. Though there are consequences, rebellion does not reduce God's control over your life or over this world, no matter how much it may feel like it does. And God's prophetic word regarding the consequences for sin and rebellion includes this clear message that God remains entirely in control of all of these events. And specifically, to God's control in this instance, we see two expressions of God's sovereignty, two clear things where God says, absolutely, this isn't changing. First, he says David's line will be preserved. So the preservation of the south and the capital of Jerusalem points to God's ultimate faithfulness. He promised David that his line would reign, a promise that pointed forward to Jesus and the ultimate answer for our redemption. And so God sticks to that promise. Even in the midst of judgment against Solomon, even in the midst of rebellion, even in the midst of a fracturing nation, God's commitment to David's line remains firm. He says nobody's touching it. It will go nowhere. But then, even in that promise, he says to Jeroboam, you're going to be blessed if you will care for Israel by loving and serving me. And so, David's line, you're going to be good, but Jeroboam, you're getting this staggering assurance of a dynasty as enduring as the one that God built for David. That's right in verse 38. But the promise, like promises before, is contingent on Jeroboam's obedience. Will you walk with me? Jeroboam must walk in obedience. He must uphold God's commands and remain steadfast in his ways. God actually says only by mirroring David's faithfulness to me, and this is important, church, not David's perfectness in his actions or his character, in his faithfulness to me. Cindy and Pastor Brianna and I were just talking about this week. The amazing thing about David is a disaster, but the thing David does not do is ever worship another god. That's the problem. And that is what Jeroboam is now being called to. And so I'm not sure if you would agree, if you read this for yourself, if I'm not here sort of inviting you to make this conclusion, but it's hard to read of God's invitations and promises within this narrative and conclude that Jeroboam was doing something that God wasn't a part of. That God wasn't somehow still over this seeming disaster, this rebellion, this conflict, this political uprising. Rebellion didn't diminish God's sovereignty. And I love this so much that I even made a slide for it. That rebellion became the backdrop against which God's authority and purpose were revealed in new and unexpected ways. And in some ways, church, as I chewed on this sentence that came from my fingers as I considered all this, that this is in so many ways a description of the gospel, that rebellion always becomes the backdrop against which God's authority and purpose are revealed in new and unexpected ways. Always. The greater the rebellion, the greater the creativity. The greater the rebellion, the greater the surprise at what God would do. So the prophet Ahijah concludes his message to Jeroboam by saying that all these events will take place to humble David's descendants, but not to eliminate the promise. Humble, but not elimination. Bring them low, but not destroy. God will not allow this moment in history, this moment where these leaders are having this peeing match, to diminish his desire for a family on the earth. He continues to use rebellion as a backdrop to display his sovereign hold on people because his greatest desire is relationship with us. And so it is for all of life's hard moments. Whether it's rebellion, tragedy, health concerns, business concerns, work concerns, or something more quiet. Maybe more personal, like fear and worry, even a dry season in our faith life. God uses those hard experiences as a backdrop for his creative and redemptive purposes. I'm about to read a verse. It's one of those powerful verses in the New Testament. It's like one of those verses that I'll just read it and I know people's hearts will respond. Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who've been called according to his purpose. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Now, when you hear this, everybody in this room, make sure you hear me. All things. Underline it. Circle it. Make it bold. All things. Practical question. What is one of the things you may have failed to remember that God will work even in that? For his purpose. Oh, not mine? No, his. His purpose for those who love him. Those who are called according to his purpose. In all things. And so the great thing that humans will do is even now, you can think up your worst case scenario. And you can come and you can challenge preachers and you can say, even in that? Even in that? How could God possibly work even in that? And I mean, I'm not gonna like wrestle and challenge like the worst things you've endured. I mean, God bless you, life is hard, I get it. But I am gonna say, like, if that is a more comforting reality for you, to hold something for yourself, to be sovereign over, God bless you, and good luck. But I think the far more comforting promise is that even in that, God is sovereign. And even in that, somehow God is going to work it together for purposes that I can't understand. In his timing, in his strength, in his creativity, in his authority, for his will, for his kingdom. I love God says not some things. I love that God says not just good things. I love that God says, I love that he doesn't say, I will work in the things that make you happy and give you good attitudes towards life. How shallow. I love that God says that in all things for the good of those who love me. God is working in your things just as he worked in Israel's division. Church, can you imagine if Canada split, what that would feel like? Imagine if the territory got busted off and now we were just on our own, and our relatives were now part of different nations, and places we used to visit are now dangerous. This is not a little thing. Don't sanitize it into just some simple little Bible story. The nation fractured, and God was somehow sovereign. That is an assurance. God works even in hard things. This truth, I came across an illustration that just reminds us of God's remarkable sovereignty even in hard things. So stick with me as I read you this story. It's a little bit too long for me to memorize. So there's this guy I came across named Robert Germain Thomas. This is him. Good beard, not a great mustache. Anybody heard of Robert Germain Thomas? I hadn't either. So this is Robert Germain Thomas's story. In about 1860-63, they feel called to go to China as missionaries. This is a long time ago. China has, got to be a much more mysterious place then than it is today. But him and his wife feel called to go. They're young. They're hopeful. They believe God has given them purpose for these people. So they go. And within months of arriving in China, his wife dies from a miscarriage. So he loses his wife and he loses his baby, all while he's doing God's work. Yet, even in his sorrow, he resolves to trust in God's plan. Now, amazingly, the tragedy alters the course of his life. And he relocates from China to a port near Korea, where he meets another Korean who is fleeing persecution. So he's sort of an exile, spiritual exile, and they meet and they get to talking, and they form a plan to basically take the gospel to Korea. And so his passion now shifts from China to Korea. And at the time, Korea is a closed nation to the gospel. And so he studies the language, he studies the culture, he prepares for this mission that seems impossible. And in 1866, 3 years later, despite at the time growing hostility towards foreigners, he joins an American trade ship, the General Sherman, that was carrying Bibles into Korea. He goes, I want to be a part of that. And so the ship is traveling up the Taedong River, and tensions begin to escalate. And the Korean government, who is resisting Western influence, sets the boat on fire, sets the ship on fire. And the whole crew has to abandon. Instead of hiding or fighting, he emerges from the river holding the Bibles, as many as he could get. And as soldiers surround him, he kneels down in front of them, and he hands out Bibles. And his final act before being killed was to give a Bible to his executioner. And that soldier, whose name is Park Chun-kwon, later reads that Bible, becomes a believer, and helps plant a church in Korea. Another boy salvages pages of these scattered Bibles, and he uses them as wallpaper. And people read them, and they come to faith from reading his walls. And this event actually is what people point to as what formed the foundation of Christianity in Korea. What seemed like a senseless tragedy became the seed of revival in a closed nation. The gospel that this guy carries throughout Korea leads to millions of people coming to Jesus Christ. Today, South Korea is one of the largest missionary sending nations in the world. And so this story reminds us that when life is chaotic, God is still sovereign. His plans are never thwarted by human resistance. And even in suffering, God is somehow still working out his purposes. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that it is full of rainbows and warm, fuzzy feelings. But I am saying that his purposes endure. One of the worst things that North American Christians believe, I'm convinced of this, is that ease is an evidence of God's plan. Often it's quite the opposite. When life feels chaotic, we can trust. And I've said this, we don't have to, but we can. We are invited to. Trust that God is sovereign. God is never surprised by human sin, but he works through it. So here's your sermon in a sentence one more time. Even in the midst of rebellion and division, God's sovereign plan remains unshaken. He uses even human failure. Like, thank God, because there's a lot of it, to fulfill his redemptive purposes and preserve his promise. The story of Israel's division in 1 Kings 11 and 12 remind us that human rebellion, whether it's Solomon's unfaithfulness, Jeroboam's grasp for power, they never overturn or outrun God's plan and God's desires. Kingdoms rise and fall. Leaders fail. People turn away from God. But his purposes remain unshaken. So what does this mean for us? I think it means this, that first we have to recognize that fear, anxiety, discouragement about the state of the world are symptoms of forgetting who is in control. I'll say that again. Fear, anxiety, and discouragement about the state of the world, or even I'll say the state of our life, are symptoms of forgetting who is in control. Just as no king or ruler in Israel's history could thwart God's plan, no world leader can, no event of us, none of our wisdom can either. The uncertainty, I think, that we feel about global events and political turmoil and moral decay, that cannot, it should not, ever shake our confidence in God's sovereignty, ever. And I think the very practical consideration for every one of us then is to consider this and honestly consider this. How much control do you really think you have? And here's why that's an important question, because as I've been thinking about this, I think this is my thesis. If we believe that we have lots of control, or believe we can have lots of control, then we believe so can other people. And if we believe that other people can have lots of control and can hold lots of control, then we have reason to worry. And I think to the degree that we go, I actually don't really have much control, then we go, and neither do they. But I think God does. Again, at the risk of repeating myself, if I go, I can have control, I'm taking control, I'm holding tightly, and I'm going to shift this for my purposes, then you better believe other people are thinking the same and are trying to do the same. And if that is true, then yeah, we're all screwed. But we're not. If we come to see that nothing, no person, no circumstance, no blind side, not even sin is out of God's control, then we do find peace and hope. Peace and hope. Secondly, we want to resist the temptation to believe that rebellion, whether ours or others, can derail God's faithfulness to his people. And this reduces it, distills it a little bit down, even just to his church, to his Israel. Sin has consequences, human decisions shape history, but God's never absent from the story. The church is such a testament to the fact that God weaves redemption into even the most broken situations, turning what seems like disaster into an opportunity for his grace to be revealed. The church should not exist. It should not stand. And it does, and it keeps growing. Finally, our call is to respond in faith. Instead of being overwhelmed by the world's instability, we're invited to trust in the unshakable foundation of God's reign and God's unrelenting desire to walk in relationship with you and me, his image bearers. So, dear church, well, you're buying only Canadian goods. Do not give in to despair, because some of them aren't very good. Instead, anchor ourselves in the truth that God's plan is still, today, this minute, unfolding. For you, for me, for the world. And he is still calling people back to himself. And until that mission is finished, we have reason for hope.